My name is Maribel, and I never thought I would admit this out loud, not in a way that lets the words settle in the air where other people can hear them and decide whether they believe me or quietly dismiss me. But there was a time when the direction your bed faced determined far more than the way sunlight spilled across your sheets in the morning. It determined what followed you into sleep, what lingered just outside your dreams, and what sometimes leaned too close to your breathing in the dark. I used to tell myself that I was only learning old customs, that every culture has its rituals, and every grandmother has her warnings. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that these weren't stories meant to make children behave or adults feel comforted. They were instructions, precise and ancient, passed down by people who had already learned the cost of ignoring them. My room back then was small, with pale walls and a narrow window that rattled when the night wind changed direction. And I remember the exact afternoon I decided to move my bed, annoyed by how cramped everything felt, craving a sense of openness that I thought could be created just by turning furniture a few inches to the left. I dragged the frame across the floor, listening to the soft scrape of metal against wood, unaware that with every inch it slid, I was slowly lining myself up with something I had once been taught to avoid. At the time, it felt like a harmless, even satisfying act, the kind of change people make when they want to feel in control of their space, and by extension, their life. And when I finally lay down that night, staring up at the familiar cracks in the ceiling, I remember feeling an odd, fleeting sense that the room itself had become quieter, as though it were holding its breath with me. Sleep came quickly, but it was shallow and uneasy, and I drifted in and out of dreams that felt more like memories that weren't mine, full of corridors, long shadows, and the impression of footsteps that never quite caught up to me. At some point, in that fragile hour when night is deepest and your body is most defenseless, I woke with my heart racing for no clear reason, my mouth dry and my skin prickling with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, and I lay there listening to the faint hum of the world outside my window, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt, as if the simple act of turning my bed had quietly rearranged the invisible boundaries of my room. I told myself it was nothing, just stress, just imagination, just the residue of too many strange stories. But even as I closed my eyes again, I couldn't shake the sense that I had accidentally answered a question I hadn't known was being asked, that I had aligned myself with something old and patient that did not need to knock before entering, and that whatever it was, it had noticed the change before I had, settling in to watch the slow rise and fall of my chest, as if waiting for an invitation I had already given without meaning to. The first rule they ever taught me was delivered so casually that I almost missed how serious it was meant to be, slipped into a longer list of instructions about candles, salt, and which days of the week were considered quiet or loud in an energetic sense, and it was simply this: never let your feet point west when you sleep. It was said with a half smile, as if it were no more important than remembering to water a plant or lock your door at night. But the room shifted when the words were spoken, the way it does when someone has accidentally brushed against something delicate. I remember blinking and asking why, expecting a neat, sensible answer about airflow or ancient symbolism. But instead I was met with a look that was both amused and wary, the kind adults give when a child asks a question they aren't ready to hear the full answer to. "Because west is the road of leaving," she said, her voice lowered, and then she moved on, already talking about something else, leaving the explanation hanging in the air like smoke that had nowhere to settle. At the time, I rolled my eyes, secretly convinced that rules like that were more about tradition than truth, the kind of things people repeat because they've always been repeated. And I even joked about it later to friends, laughing about how apparently my bed had opinions about the afterlife. But something about the way the rule had been given stayed with me, and I found myself glancing at my own room more often than I used to, mentally noting where my head rested and where my feet fell, as if part of me was quietly checking whether I was obeying a boundary I didn't fully understand. There was a faint tension that began to live in my chest whenever I imagined turning the bed, a whisper of unease that I dismissed as nerves, though I couldn't have explained why a piece of furniture should make me feel watched. Over time, I learned that the rule wasn't unique to the people I was studying with. Variations of it appeared in old books, in faded margins, in offhand comments from elders who had never met each other but somehow shared the same quiet warning. Each version carried a slightly different story, but they all circled the same idea, that West was a direction of endings, of thresholds, of things passing from one state into another, and that sleep, being its own small kind of crossing, made you more noticeable if you lined yourself up with it. I pretended not to care, telling myself I was too modern, too practical to let something so intangible influence my habits, and yet I never actually moved my bed, not until that afternoon when restlessness got the better of me and I decided I wanted my room to feel bigger, brighter, more open. I remember thinking how silly it was that a rule like that had ever made me hesitate. How freeing it felt to drag the frame across the floor and rearrange my space according to my own taste, unaware that in ignoring the first lesson I had ever been given, I was also quietly stepping into the very territory it had been meant to keep me away from. After I moved the bed, I started noticing how often direction came up in the things I was reading and hearing, as if the world had quietly decided to underline a word I had skimmed past too quickly. It was in old notes copied by hand, in whispered comments made over cups of tea, in the way certain doors were never placed directly opposite windows in houses that had been standing for more than a century. Direction, I began to realize, wasn't treated as a simple matter of north, south, east, and west. It was treated like a language, one spoken without sound, a grammar of space that told you where to pause, where to pass through, and where not to linger too long. East was spoken of with a kind of gentleness, associated with light, beginnings, and things that wanted to grow. South carried warmth and comfort, the feeling of resting your back against something solid. North was quieter, heavier, tied to memory and ancestry, to the sense of standing in a place where many others had stood before you. West, though, always seemed to be handled differently, as if people were careful not to say too much about it all at once, describing it in fragments that hinted at endings, transitions, and the thinning of boundaries between one state and another. I told myself that these were just poetic metaphors layered over practical traditions, yet my body reacted to them in ways my rational mind couldn't fully explain. I began waking at the same minute every night, my eyes opening before I was fully conscious, my heart already beating too fast, as if some internal alarm had been tripped long before I had time to understand why. The room would be perfectly still, the shadows unchanged, and yet I would lie there with the uncomfortable certainty that something about the space itself had shifted, that the quiet wasn't empty, but attentive. Even on nights when I managed to fall back asleep quickly, my dreams took on a sharper edge, filled with long hallways that seemed to stretch farther the more I walked them, doors that opened onto other doors, and a constant sense of being almost, but not quite, caught. I started paying attention to how my breath sounded in the dark, to the way my own movements seemed louder than they should have been, as though the room were amplifying them for an unseen listener. During the day, nothing felt particularly wrong, but there was a low, persistent tension humming beneath my thoughts, a feeling that I had misaligned something important and was living inside the consequences without yet knowing their shape. I tried to rationalize it, blaming stress, poor sleep, too much caffeine, anything that would allow me to dismiss the unease as a temporary phase. Yet I couldn't ignore how consistently it returned once night fell. It was as if my body recognized something my waking mind refused to name, responding to the silent geometry of the room, to the way my sleeping form had been placed in relation to the invisible lines of direction that quietly stitched the world together. The night it finally crossed from uneasy feeling into something I could no longer explain away was quiet in the way that makes every small sound feel too loud. The refrigerator humming in the other room, the faint tick of cooling pipes in the walls, the steady, familiar rhythm of my own breathing rising and falling in the dark. I had fallen asleep with the light from the street lamp cutting a pale stripe across the floor, my curtains barely moving, and for a while everything was ordinary, comfortably forgettable, until I surfaced from sleep without any clear reason, my eyes opening as if someone had called my name even though the room was empty. I lay still, staring into the dimness, waiting for my heart to slow, when I became aware of a subtle change in the air, a heaviness that hadn't been there a moment before, like the pressure you feel just before a storm breaks. Then, slowly, unmistakably, the mattress shifted. It wasn't a dramatic jolt, nothing that would have sent me bolting upright, but a careful, deliberate dip, as if someone had eased their weight onto the edge of the bed, testing whether I would react. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I was convinced that if I turned my head, I would see a familiar shape, a person who had simply come into my room without waking me, but I didn't move. Fear had made my body heavy, every muscle locked in place, my thoughts racing through 1,000 explanations that all fell apart as quickly as they formed. The room felt colder, the chill settling against my skin in a way that made the fine hairs on my arms lift. And yet there was also a strange warmth pressed close to my legs, as though something was near enough to share heat. I focused on the ceiling, on the tiny crack that ran like a pale vein across it, trying to convince myself that what I was feeling was only the echo of a dream, that my mind had carried some imagined sensation into waking life. But the weight remained, steady and patient. Time stretched in a way that made it hard to tell whether seconds or minutes were passing, and all I could hear was my own pulse beating too loudly in my ears, each thump a reminder that I was awake, aware, and entirely alone. Eventually, just as slowly as it had come, the pressure lifted, the mattress rising back into its familiar shape, leaving behind a hollow cold that felt more unsettling than the weight itself had been. I didn't move for a long while after that, afraid that any sudden shift would invite whatever had been there to return. And when I finally worked up the courage to sit up, the room looked exactly as it always had, quiet, empty, ordinary. In the pale light of morning, I noticed a faint discoloration along my ankle, tender to the touch, as if I had bumped into something in my sleep, and even as I tried to laugh it off, a deeper part of me understood that the uneasy nights, the whispered rules, and the silent geometry of my room had been leading me patiently to this moment. These days, I do things differently, though the habits aren't born from fear so much as from a careful respect for what I once experienced, and a recognition that some rules, however strange they seem, are not meant to be broken lightly. I sleep with my head facing east, aligning myself with beginnings rather than endings, letting the first light of morning spill over me without hesitation, and I notice the difference immediately in the quality of my rest. The room feels lighter, as if the unseen boundaries that once pressed so insistently against me have relaxed, allowing me to breathe fully without catching in my chest. I keep the space under my bed completely clear. No boxes, no dust-covered books, no forgotten shoes, nothing that could create hiding places for things that prefer shadow over light. Mirrors are angled carefully, never reflecting my sleeping form directly, because even when I no longer practice, I remember how easily reflection can become a doorway if the alignment is wrong, and I do not want to test that. The rituals are subtle now, almost invisible, tiny movements like closing doors quietly, drawing the curtains so they fall evenly, smoothing the sheets in precise, methodical folds. But the effects are real. Sleep is different when the environment itself is carefully arranged, when the geometry of a room doesn't silently point you toward transition, exposure, or passage. I have learned to read the air in a space the same way I used to read herbs and candles, noticing tension that doesn't belong, sounds that shouldn't be there, and the quiet weight of the corners when something is not quite at rest. I keep a small bowl of salt on the windowsill, not because I need protection so much as a reminder, a tactile signal to my mind and body that boundaries exist and should be respected. I have accepted that my own presence matters in the unseen order of things, that how I lie, where I face, and how I allow my breath to settle can either invite or discourage what moves in the periphery of awareness. People who hear this often smile politely, perhaps thinking it's superstition or a quirk of someone who once believed too much. But I know the truth of it in the steady rhythm of a night spent resting without interruption, the absence of the familiar prickling of unease that used to greet me as darkness fell. I don't practice spells anymore. I don't light incense or recite names in quiet corners. But the lessons of alignment, attention, and respect linger like muscle memory in the body. I move through my apartment with an awareness that is quiet but constant, checking positions of furniture, noticing the angles of doors, ensuring that windows do not create unintended pathways. Even simple acts, like turning off a lamp or closing a book, become rituals in miniature, a way of signaling to the world, both visible and invisible, that I intend to remain undisturbed. Each night, before I lie down, I take a moment to consider how the room has been arranged, where my feet will fall, whether my head is pointing in the direction that invites safety rather than exposure, and I feel a subtle but unmistakable sense of calm settle over me, a quiet triumph that comes from knowing that what once frightened me no longer holds power over my sleep. I'm telling you all of this not because I want to frighten you, though I know that admitting the truth about something unseen carries its own weight, but because I want you to understand that what seems like a simple choice, the way you arrange your room, the direction your bed faces, the angle of a mirror, or the placement of a chair, can carry consequences far beyond what most people imagine. Most people never think about how space itself communicates, how the alignment of objects can signal openness or closure, invitation or warning. And yet I have learned that sleep is a time when the body becomes incredibly honest, when defenses drop and the quiet attentiveness of the world around you becomes impossible to ignore. I don't expect anyone to take my word at face value, but I can describe it in the language I know. There is a subtle pulse to rooms, an invisible geometry that shifts with the way we move and place ourselves. And when you lie down without thought, you may find that you have accidentally left yourself exposed, that you have unknowingly aligned with thresholds meant for other purposes, for beings or energies that notice far more than we do. I remember the nights when I ignored the rules, turning my bed with the arrogance of someone who thinks experience is more important than caution. And I remember the unease that followed, the way shadows seemed to stretch and lean, the way a silence could feel crowded, the faint pressure that pressed against me even when I lay still, as though the room itself was aware of my misalignment. People rarely talk about this openly. They dismiss what they cannot see or measure, and so the knowledge becomes quiet, whispered, passed along in half-remembered warnings or coded stories that seem quaint until you realize they are instructions for survival. I tell you because I want you to notice what I couldn't at first, to respect the spaces you inhabit, not as a superstition, not as fear, but as an awareness that has roots in patterns older than most of us can imagine. There is a difference between thinking a room is empty and knowing that it is attentive, a difference between believing that sleep is merely a pause in consciousness and understanding that it is a vulnerable, liminal state where small misalignments can have consequences. Even if you do not believe in spirits, the body understands, reacting instinctively to arrangement, orientation, and alignment, and those reactions are rarely wrong. I want you to feel the weight of this knowledge not as a burden but as a guidance, a quiet way of caring for yourself for the hours when your mind sleeps and your body remains aware in ways you cannot name. The direction you choose, the order you maintain, the attentiveness you offer your own space, they are not trivial. They speak to something ancient and persistent, something that has watched humanity carefully, quietly, through centuries of night, and that continues to respond to the small choices we make about where we rest, how we breathe, and what we leave open. I am telling you because I cannot leave it unsaid, because I know how easily the signs can be ignored, and because the long nights I endured, the subtle pressures and moments of awareness that I still remember, are evidence that even small changes in habit can ripple outward, affecting more than just comfort. They can influence the very way the world listens to you while you sleep. I don't practice anymore. I don't light candles to call names I once whispered into smoke. I don't carry the weight of charms or the lines of inked sigils on my hands. And yet, every night, without fail, I pause before I lie down, and I examine the space around me as if it were alive, as if it were waiting for my permission to either accept me or ignore me, to leave me in quiet peace, or remind me sharply that I have forgotten the lessons I was once taught. I run my eyes along the edges of the room, over the corners where shadows linger longest, noting the angles of furniture, the gaps beneath doors, the reflections that might catch me off guard in a mirror's eye. I smooth the sheets, not as a habit, but as a boundary, a thin but clear line between the world of the living and the invisible threads that wind quietly around us, threads that only show themselves to those willing to look, willing to notice. I place my head to the east, aligning with beginnings, breathing in carefully, letting the air fill the space around me in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I straighten my feet, knowing that a careless angle could invite the unknown in ways subtle and persistent, and I leave nothing beneath my bed, nothing that could conceal or encourage anything that prefers darkness over light. Each action is a silent agreement between myself and forces I no longer name, an unspoken acknowledgement that boundaries matter and that alignment is not a superstition but a language, one that speaks in the pulse of the air, in the subtle pressure of the room, in the way the night itself listens. I walk through this routine not as fear but as respect, because respect is stronger than fear, and I have learned that the smallest negligence can carry consequences far heavier than imagined. Sleep becomes not a surrender, but a negotiation, a quiet conversation conducted in breath and stillness, a recognition that while I lie down, the world continues to observe, attentive and patient, ready to respond to the slightest invitation or lapse. I have learned to feel the weight of silence as I once felt the weight of presence, to sense the tension in empty corners, to recognize the spaces where attention gathers and where it drifts away. I keep the windows closed, the curtains drawn just so, the mirrors angled in ways that do not reflect my sleeping form, and I do all of this not because I am afraid, but because I am aware. Awareness is the armor that cannot be pierced by whim or neglect. And yet, despite all these precautions, there is an edge, a question that never leaves the back of my mind, because the unseen is patient and its memory is long. Every night, as my head touches the pillow, I ask myself if I have done enough, if the space around me has been aligned properly, if my body speaks the correct language to the world beyond what the eyes can see. I close my eyes slowly, but never with certainty, because certainty is a luxury I once learned leads to mistakes, to openings, to consequences. And I wonder if you were in my place, if you felt the same subtle pressures, the same attentive silences, if you understood that the orientation of a bed, the placement of objects, and the angles of reflection were all words in a conversation with something patient and ancient, what would you do differently? Would you take the warnings seriously, or would you dismiss them as folly? Would you feel the cold press of attention in the dark, or would your mind convince you that nothing unseen can matter? The room does not lie, and the body never forgets. And I have learned that those two truths are enough to demand your attention long before your intellect catches up. As I lie here, knowing what I know, feeling what I have felt, the question remains open, waiting for the listener to decide, waiting for you to measure your own space and consider what message it sends. For the night does not forgive ignorance, and the walls themselves remember, and the direction of a bed is never just a matter of comfort. It is an invitation, a challenge, and a test all at once. And the answer you give in your own mind, the choice you make in arranging your own room, will echo long after the lights have gone out.